Hello, this is George from George's Music Blog, and today I'm talking about Selection 16 by Squarepusher, the experimental jungle/jazz musician and producer also known as Tom Jenkinson. As always, I'm coming into this video from the perspective of a fan, so don't expect an unbiased review. If you're a Squarepusher fan like me, then hopefully you'll find my take interesting. If you're new to his music and you're curious and want to hear a bit more about what it's all about, then you've also come to the right place. So let's get into it. Selection 16 is Squarepusher's fourth album and was released in 1999 on Warp Records. It was part of a glut of Pusher material that came out across 98 and 99, which included the Music is Rotted One Note album and the Budokan Mindphone and Maximum Priest EPs. Much like his previous work, it features live instruments with heavy jazz influences, as well as pieces more heavily driven by processed and sampled electronic breakbeats. And in particular, this album featured more predominant use of the Roland TB-303 bass synthesizer, most typically known for its use in acid house. As the name suggests, Selection 16 comprises 16 tracks, and it also implies to me that Squarepusher couldn't think of a title for this one. Several of the tracks are under 2 minutes, shorter interludes, and they're mostly jazz-inspired, experimental passages that help string together the more substantial tracks. There's a couple tacked on the end which are labelled as remixes, including one credited to Ceephax, also known as Andy Jenkinson, Squarepusher's brother, although it should be mentioned he has an extensive discography and is a beloved live performer with an illustrious career in his own right. And it's this kind of flung together feeling that makes Selection 16 a bit of a black sheep in Squarepusher's discography. It's not an album I ever purchased, although full disclosure, I did acquire a lot of MP3s through file sharing platforms back in the day, so I did have a ripped and burned copy, but it was not a disc that ever made it into heavy rotation for me. And coming into this review, I was ready to write Selection 16 off as a collection of half-baked ideas knocked together from the cutting room floor of other albums. It always felt to me like a compilation, which was the kind of thing record labels would put out when an artist was getting big and they wanted to cash in on some previously unreleased material. But having played it quite a few times recently in preparation for this video, I've been reminded A, how there's a few really decent tracks on here, and B, how, although it doesn't flow all that particularly well, it does at least have its own identity and feel to it. The jazz interludes create space for Tom to lay down his breakbeat workouts and gives them a bit of breathing room. Those pieces very much feel like products of the same sessions that birthed Music is Rotted One Note. And part of me wonders if this album was rushed out in an attempt to try and win back the portion of the fan base that was alienated and turned off by that record, which, being an album of experimental jazz fusion, was a complete left turn for Squarepusher at the time, given he'd been making his name as an experimental drill and bass artist. Or what's more likely, it was simply a very prolific time for Tom Jenkinson, and Warp were more than happy to have another album's worth of material to put out. So let's get into the details. My favourite track on the album is Dedicated Loop. Tom takes things down from his usual breathless tempo of around 180 BPM to around the 140 BPM mark with a very tasty breakbeat loop, which almost has a bit of a UK garage feel to it. The 303 comes to the fore with a lovely squelchy driving riff. It's such an iconic sound, people are still rinsing it now, even 3.5 decades on from the advent of acid house. So those elements alone would make it a decent enough track. But it might be here that we see Tom making his first foray into what I would call his cosmic melodic style. I've spoken before about how so many of his melodies, especially in his 90s phase, evoke the feeling of suburbia and that kind of mundane, everyday world of the semi-urban environment, along with a hefty dose of nostalgia. Check out my video on Hard Normal Daddy, linked below for more on that. But here, Tom takes things up into outer space with this soaring synth line floating high above the mix that very heavily calls to mind flying through the stars at warp speed. This is a realm he'll come back to many times over his career. Think tracks like Welcome to Europe off Hello Everything or Tetrasync off Ultra Visitor, to name just a couple of examples. Tomorrow World is probably the best loved track off Selection 16, judging by the number of streams anyway. It's not as spacey as Dedicated Loop, but it does have a strong sci-fi feel to it, albeit a kind of retro kitsch kind of sci-fi. I pictured Tomorrow World like an illustration from a 1970s school textbook with flying cars and people on jetpacks flitting about a shining, glistening city composed of cuboid buildings. It has a pleasant melody which really gets in your head, and Tom balances his tendency for mania with a fairly restrained beat rather than taking us down the usual jazz-inspired meandering journey. Snake Pass is another cut built around a buzzing 303 line. It could almost be classed as hard techno or acid techno, given the fairly straight fall to the floor beat. It's not a typical Squarepusher sound, but it does have this cool vibe of kind of low-level menace and suppressed energy in the pacey beat and the driving 303 line, which rather than going into some kind of freewheeling melody just serves to drive the rhythm and the energy of the track. Now, much like Chin Hippie on Hardenable Daddy or North Circular on Feed Me Weird Things, Mind Rubbers is the token hectic track where Tom indulges his penchant and flexes his considerable skill for chopping and rearranging breakbeats. Mind Rubbers is less memorable or exciting than either of those two examples, as it is than any of the later variations on this theme, such as Anstrom Effect 4 off Dino Squarepusher, or a track like the modern bass guitar on Hello Everything. Here it feels a little bit like he's just going through the motions and it's been included for the sake of it. If selection 16 could be said to have a centerpiece, then it would be Schizm Track number 1, a stumbling down-tempo jam that incorporates what sounds like a Roland 909 drum machine or another similar piece of kit, a bass guitar fed through some kind of effects, and a sample of Kool Keith, hip-hop legend and one-time member of the rap group Ultramagnetic MCs. The dank vibe of electronic meets jazz could have fit very well on his debut Feed Me Weird Things, but some of the effects Jenkinson applies to some of the drum hits result in some very harsh, high-pitched sounds, which just make it a bit of a chore to listen to for me. More enjoyable is Schizm number 2 track Mix, which is tacked onto the end. Whether it bears any relation to number 1, apart from just the title, is not clear. It's another acid breakbeat cut. Kind of makes me wish Squarepusher could have just recorded a whole album of acid breakbeat. Though to be fair, I guess that was very similar to the style that Ceephax was operating in at the time. The Ceephax mix, just to mention it briefly, is more experimental and moody than the kind of hyper dayglow sound he was associated with at the time. Layers of drum breaks are piled atop one another, while a pulsing synth builds menacingly until a brighter melodic line finally breaks through the chaos before being subsumed again by cascades of percussion. More than anything, the track seems to be an impressive exercise in keeping God knows how many drum machines synced together. On reflection, selection 16 is never going to be my favourite Squarepusher album. It just doesn't have that uncanny spark of, dare I say it, genius running through it like so many of his others. But it does see him trying out a slightly different sound with stronger acid elements and taking a less self-consciously serious stance than he usually does, which you can only applaud. If it happens to be your favourite Squarepusher album, then I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Likewise, if you agree or disagree with any of my opinions, please let me know. Otherwise, that's it from me. Thanks so much for watching. Please check out my channel for more of the same. Please like the video if you're still watching at this point. Until next time, see you later. Goodbye.